are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Butler of Faith Trust Institute, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation, Interim Ministers and After Pastors, What You Need to Know. I'll introduce our presenter in a moment, but first a few technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. We welcome your questions during the presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end to answer all of your questions. You can submit them anytime using the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll hold on to them until the presentation is completed. The slides you see on your screen during the presentation will be emailed to you later this afternoon as a PDF, so you'll have them as a reference going forward. And lastly, we're recording this webinar for those who can't attend in person, so we'll make this available on our website. We welcome those who may be listening to the recording. We want to thank In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. It's part of a series of 12 that they've sponsored in 2014 as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. They've sponsored dozens of webinars in the past few years, and you can find recordings of many of those on our website. Please visit infaithfound.org to read more about this series and the other great work that they're doing, and again, we thank them for their sponsorship. Today's presenter is Reverend Dr. Marie M. Fortune. She is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic violence and sexual assault. She's championed the importance of healthy boundaries, interpreting scripture and sacred text to support the safety and well-being of not only women and children, but families and communities. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. Audience members, if you have questions, please submit them anytime on the question box on your right-hand screen. And then, Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hello.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Can you hear me now?
I can. You're good.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you who've tuned in with us today. Looking forward to spending the next hour with you, and I really hope that you have questions and that you will share those questions in the text box as we go along. Please feel free at any point to raise a question. This subject of the work that many of you do as interim ministers and what has now come to be known as after pastors has certainly intrigued me over the years as I've worked on the issues of clergy misconduct and abuse. And actually the term after pastor, I think, came from those of you who have done this work and have encountered the situation of following a pastor who has engaged in boundary violations and clergy misconduct before you arrived on the scene. And the other thing that I have noticed over the years when I've had the opportunity to meet with groups of interim pastors in various settings and conferences and to talk about these issues is I always ask how many of you, as an interim pastor, many of you are professional interims, how many of you have encountered a situation where you did follow someone who had engaged in misconduct? And generally speaking, when people raise their hands, it's usually 75% or so of the interim ministers gathered who have had that experience. So although that's anecdotal, I'm assuming that it's not a common experience for those of you who do work as interim ministers. And your role is a very important one in following that situation because you are one of the key players in helping a congregation move through what they've experienced when the misconduct and betrayal of trust becomes known. So you are the person who follows someone who's engaged in various kinds of misconduct that may involve sexual boundary crossing and violations, financial mismanagement or embezzlement, a number of different kinds of betrayals of trust that you might encounter. And you will have probably one of two experiences. Either that information is unknown to you for a variety of reasons. Either it's unknown to everybody outside of the persons who've experienced it in the congregation, or perhaps it's known to your adjudicatory but not shared with you, which would be very unfortunate, I think. But for some of you, you do have that information, and it is disclosed to you either by your adjudicatory or by leadership in the congregation where you've been called to serve as an interim. So next slide, please. If it is unknown to you, what you will observe in the life of the congregation when you arrive there is poor or confused boundaries. You will see that in the way in which the laity interact with you and with each other. It will be pretty apparent in most cases. You will observe mistrust of you and just a general feeling of mistrust throughout the congregation. There will be secrets, and secrets that really aren't secrets but people think are secrets. So there will be a whole air of secrecy. And things that we don't talk about is the way some people describe it in a congregation. There will also be anger, depending on people's different experiences of what has preceded you. There's likely to be a general malaise, a general depression in the congregation, and that's certainly understandable and predictable. There probably will have been or will be a loss of membership, people who, for a variety of reasons, again, have left the congregation, either because of their sense of betrayal or because at the point of disclosure, people take sides and sometimes the congregation splits. There will be disclosures to you, even if this is unknown information to you, and people will do that in a variety of ways. But they may do it very ambiguously and very hesitantly, but there will be people who will try to tell you that something has preceded you that has been very destructive to their congregation. Next slide, please. If the information has been disclosed to you by the adjudicatory or by leadership in the congregation, you will observe poor and confused boundaries, mistrust, secrecy, anger, malaise, loss of members, and disclosures to you from individuals. In other words, you will observe the same dynamics, whether or not you've been told that the minister who preceded you engaged in misconduct. So your awareness of these factors and hopefully some of the things we're talking about today will prepare you either way, whether you in fact have information of what's preceded you or not, to hopefully prepare you to deal with the needs of the congregation, regardless of whether you've been given explicit information about the misconduct. Next slide. So if that information has not come to you, your main task is to pay attention, to be listening carefully to people and the concerns that they may share with you, and to be willing to ask questions to try to discern what in fact has gone on. Because you may be then the person who can help the congregation begin to name what happened. If it has been disclosed to you, you have certainly more of an opportunity to help the congregation to move through whatever process it needs to experience in terms of grief and anger and so forth in pursuing their own healing. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So either way, you have a role to play that's very, very important, and you can be a valuable resource to the congregation. Next slide. The congregation will always be tempted at this point following the departure of an abusive pastor. And these are just some of the ways that I've seen that temptation play out. There will be those who want to just keep the lid on the situation, and they're of the mind that, well, maybe some bad things happen, but let's not talk about it. Let's just move forward and leave that to the past. And I'll talk in a minute about why that's not a good idea, but basically that will be a common response from some people, particularly in leadership. The let's just move on, denial and avoidance really is let's pretend like this didn't happen and move forward. Again, not helpful ultimately to the life of the congregation and what they really need to do. If there is some awareness that, in fact, there was misconduct and there might have been a process by which the judicatory or the leadership in the congregation dealt with the disclosures of abuse, there may be a response of forgive and forget, which is not very helpful theology at this point. And I'll talk a little bit more about that again in a few minutes. But the notion that, again, forgive and forget is basically the same thing as let's move on, denial and avoidance. It's just put in a theological context to justify that response, and it's not very good theology ultimately. The blaming the victim temptation is always there, and it's definitely something that you need to watch for, and you can be helpful in reframing the situation to try to avoid it. And the reason people do that is it's just a way of scapegoating that the problem here is that people came forward and disclosed the fact that they were harmed. And if they simply hadn't done that, our church wouldn't be in this mess. And again, I think you can appreciate how that would not be very helpful to what a congregation needs to do to recover from this experience. And then finally, the temptation for the congregation is to uncritically support the offending clergy person. And that takes us back to just denial that this ever happened. I remember a congregation that I consulted with a number of years ago where the pastor had been sexually abusing the teenage girls in the youth group. And because it finally came out that this was happening and the girls were underage, he was in fact arrested and convicted and served time in prison. When he came out of prison, there were some in leadership in the congregation who wanted to bring him back into leadership in spite of what he had done and the fact that he had served time in prison for his crimes. So that's kind of the extreme of the support of an offending clergy person. But again, people are confused and in pain, and they don't want to give up on their image of who that clergy person was to them. And that's part of what then tempts them to not want to hear this news and not want to deal with the implication. So these are the things that you should listen for, and that hopefully you can help the congregation begin to look at critically and move through. For you as the interim minister, you also have temptations. And certainly one of them is to ignore and avoid, and particularly, again, if this hasn't come out in any formal process, but you begin to pick up the hints of what in fact was clergy misconduct, you certainly are in a position to ignore and avoid that information. And you also are tempted to solve, if you will, the problem by removing the survivors who are identified as the problem. So if there are people who do come to you and disclose that they've been harmed by the previous pastor, I've seen situations, unfortunately, where the current pastor or the leadership have urged those individuals to leave the congregation and find another faith community because they are seen as somehow disruptive to the life of the congregation. So again, needless to say, that's not a helpful response, but I think it's one that, again, you need to be aware of and conscious of, that it is an option. It's just not a very helpful option. Next slide, please. I always think it's helpful to access our own resources as people of faith in dealing with these situations. And certainly this particular passage from Jeremiah, I think, frames the challenge very succinctly. In chapter 6, we read, "From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." And that's a description of all the things that I listed in the previous slide, the temptations by leadership to deny, minimize, and move on. And again, in fact, the wound has to be addressed, and I'll speak to that briefly in a few minutes, how to address the wound. But when we do pretend like it wasn't a big deal, or let's not deal with it, or let's leave that to the past, Jeremiah nails it with this critique that they have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. And that is not the path to healing. Next slide, please. In fact, what people need, the congregation that you are serving as an interim, and hopefully if you have been made aware of this by the judicatory, and there has been some process of accountability for the offending pastor and so forth. So if you're working in a context where it's not just you, but it's you in concert with the leadership of the congregation and the leadership of your judicatory, these are the things that I think need to happen in a congregation, and you can be a part of helping facilitate these particular things. The first thing that people need is information about what happened and what action has been taken. And this information ideally comes from the judicatory, who has taken some action, who is functioning out of a policy and procedure with a standard response. But people deserve to know the particulars in terms of the nature of the complaints that have been brought against the previous pastor, and the process that the judicatory used to address those complaints, and then the action they took to either discipline or somehow respond to that misconduct. So ideally, working with you, a representative of the judicatory can bring that information to a congregational meeting early on, so that people can ask questions and understand the process that's going on. But part of that early response also is simply education of the congregation about what is clergy misconduct. Because one of the challenges here is that what people have experienced either individually as individuals who've been harmed, or secondarily as members of the congregation whose trust has also been betrayed, they don't have a conceptual framework for what is this thing that has happened. And so I think one of the most important roles of the interim pastor and anyone from the judicatory in terms of a response team or the leadership there is simply providing people with some educational content about this is the nature of this problem. And I'm going to review some of the key points in that in just a moment to give you a sense of what people need to know. What I find is that when people who are going through this particular trauma have a way of seeing and understanding it, it gives them a handle on what's happened to them and a place to deal with their emotional response. In the absence of any information or education, they have nothing but their emotional response, and that can often be all over the map. So this is a way to give some structure to what they're feeling in the context now of what they know about what has just happened to them. Certainly, people need pastoral care and support, and that will be both individually and collectively in terms of, again, your role as an interim pastor here. They need a theological framework. What does all this mean in terms of their faith life? Where is God in this trauma? And you have the opportunity to help shape that. One of the scripture passages that I always go to in dealing with situations of clergy misconduct that I would suggest to you at this point is, again, from the book of Jeremiah in the 17th chapter, beginning with the 5th verse. Jeremiah says this, "Thus says the Lord, cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength, whose hearts turn away from God. They shall be like a shrub in the desert and shall not see when relief comes. They shall live in parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed are those who trust in God, whose trust is in God. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes. Its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought it is not anxious. It does not cease to bear fruit." And what Jeremiah speaks to there is the experience of what happens when we do put all of our trust in an individual, particularly a charismatic individual, who then tragically betrays that trust. And it reminds us as people of faith that, in fact, our trust needs to be in God and in our faith tradition and our faith community, and that is the source of sustenance through these periods when, in fact, an individual leader has betrayed the trust of the people. So that's just an example of how you can bring a theological framework, a scriptural framework, to this discussion with your people and begin to bring them back to the fundamentals of our faith tradition. People also need a space for their anger and grief, and again, individual and corporate. And so that means individuals who may ask to speak with you to share their experience or their concerns, but also in terms of the corporate experience. And this is a place that, again, I think naming that experience in worship leadership, in prayers, in scripture readings, and so forth, is an important way for the congregation as a whole to have a sense that they're walking together through a period of grief and loss and the anger that comes with that, and that's okay, and that the congregation can be the container that can hold that experience and help people move through it. And finally, I find that people need to be able to integrate this experience into their history. And people have done this in a variety of different ways, but it reminds me of the experience of congregations that have been through other kinds of trauma, like a fire that has destroyed the church, or a tornado that's completely wiped out the church building. And, you know, years into the future, when the history of the congregation is shared with new members and so forth, those experiences have been pivotal and they become part of the story of the congregation. And sometimes congregations mark those anniversaries of those events with a particular service or liturgical moment. And I think that's really important in this case as well, that it needs to be acknowledged as part of the history of the congregation. That there was a time when we went through this, there was a time when we had a pastor who tragically took advantage of members in ways that were deeply hurtful and traumatic. And we moved through that and survived that and have moved forward. But to not include it in part of the story of the congregation and its history, I think does not help, and again takes us back to the minimization and denial. So that's some of the things that I think are most important that you can either bring or facilitate as an interim pastor in response to a situation of clergy misconduct. Next slide, please. So your job as the interim is to recognize all that's going on and, again, normalize that this, of course, people are angry, hurt, ashamed. That's often part of what people are struggling with. If this has come out in some kind of public discussion or perhaps in the media, there's a sense of embarrassment and shame that this has happened in our church. And that's real, and that needs to be named and acknowledged. But certainly there's a sense of betrayal, that the one whom they trusted as their pastor has betrayed that trust. So you can also create that safe place for disclosures and conversations, and keeping an open door and being available to people to be able to come to you in their own time and share their concerns. The importance of leading the education and information dimension of this. And the recognition that a congregation who goes through this is going through the normal stages of grief and loss, even though there may be a consensus among the congregation and the leadership of the nature of the betrayal and so forth, and a clarity and an anger about that, there is still a dimension of grief and loss because of what it puts people through. So sometimes giving that framework can, again, give people context in which they can process what they're feeling. It's really important in your role as an interim pastor to practice good boundaries with people. And that may be very new to them if they've particularly had a pastor for 20 years who's had poor boundaries and they've not experienced that. For you to come in and have good boundaries and be clear about where those boundaries are, they may initially react and push back against that. But your job is to model that so that they can begin to see the value of healthy boundaries in relating to their pastor. And then the importance of being proactive and bringing leadership to this process because you have the opportunity to help them through an important phase of their healing process during the time you're there as their interim. So next slide, please. So briefly, I want to cover the basics of basically what the congregation needs to know. And if you have a response team in your judicatory, this is something that they often are able to provide, to come in and offer a presentation using videos, some of the videos that we produce here at Faith Trust and so forth, to educate the congregation. But in any case, these are some of the basic things that they need to be aware of in terms of what we call Clergy Misconduct 101. Next slide. First of all, to emphasize that the goals of faithful leadership, first of all, is to maintain the integrity of the ministerial relationship. And part of that is the protection of those who are vulnerable in the congregation due to their roles, but also their particular life circumstances. So congregants, clients, employees, staff who are staffing the congregation, students who may be involved in field education or internships, other staff members, and so forth. So these persons are vulnerable partly because they are being supervised often by a pastoral leader if they are staff or employees, but also as congregants because of their relationship directly with the pastor. And in their vulnerability, they bring their particular life crises and circumstances and deserve to be protected and not exploited in those circumstances. Next slide. One of the real challenges is that, again, the importance of information about clergy misconduct, and specifically where sexual boundary violations have occurred, is that people tend to rationalize what happened with naming this problem in a variety of ways that never get to the real point. And these are just some of the things that you will hear. Well, it was just an affair. It was a momentary lapse of judgment, a midlife crisis. The previous pastor suffered from sexual addiction. It was sexual misconduct. It was adultery. It was therapy for the congregant that the pastor may have violated. None of these descriptors are adequate to an understanding of what happened here. Let me speak to the adultery one specifically because that's the one that's most confusing to people. We can't simply label sexual boundary violations between a pastor and a congregant, either or both of whom may be married or in a committed relationship, as adultery. The adultery happens, but it happens as a consequence of the boundary violations that the clergy person engages in terms of crossing professional boundaries and taking advantage of a person's vulnerability. So in terms of the church's responsibility to oversee that clergy person, we need to be focused on the fact that they have betrayed their pastoral role with individuals. And so the description that we provide here is, it's unfortunately long, but it's also important to be clear about what happens in clergy misconduct, and specifically, again, focusing here on sexual boundary violations. It is clergy misconduct when any person in a ministerial role of leadership or pastoral counseling, regardless of status, so clergy, religious, or lay, engages in sexual contact or sexualized behavior with any number of people, as I listed in the previous slide: congregants, clients, employees, students, staff members, etc., regardless of age, in the professional pastoral relationship. So basically what this does is it's both a definition, but it's also a statement of policy, a statement of an ethical norm that says it is misconduct when persons in leadership take advantage of someone and violate sexual boundaries. So that's where we need to help people understand what's really going on here. Next slide. And when we think about clergy who do engage in sexual boundary violations, we tend to think about and see, in fact, those behaviors on a continuum. Again, I think this is a helpful way for people to understand what is happening and what their particular experience has been. On the one side of the continuum, the predator side, what we find there are people who are literally sexual predators and some of whom tragically have gone into the ministry because they knew that it was a place that they would have access to vulnerable people, whether adults or youth or children. And so they are very systematic and very intentional about the way in which they then engage in boundary violations. And they often also tend to be sociopathic in their own personalities, narcissistic and sociopathic, and they really don't have much of a sense that there's any problem here, that there's anything wrong with what they're doing, because they, in terms of being a sociopath, they don't have any conscience about harm that they may cause to other people. They don't see what they're doing as harmful and something that should concern them. So that's the far end of the continuum on the right-hand side. As we move to the left, what we begin to see in terms of behaviors is what we've always called wandering behavior. And this tends to be the clergy person who has just simply poor boundaries, has had no training or little training around boundary issues, has no awareness of the importance of healthy boundaries, and is kind of just all over the place in terms of how they interact with people. And unfortunately, this sometimes means that they engage in behavior that is emotionally or sexually or physically a violation of another person. Now, I want to be clear that regardless of where people fall in this continuum, the damage they can cause is significant. And the experience of the congregant or staff member who's on the receiving end of the boundary violation is significant regardless of the nature of the abuse by the clergy person. But we do need to understand the difference in terms of what needs to happen in accountability in dealing with folks depending on where they fall in the continuum. For example, predators who are pedophiles and target children clearly need to be reported to the police and prosecuted for criminal behavior. Or someone who is in fact assaultive in their behavior towards a congregant at any age. Those folks are engaging in criminal behavior, and that needs to be addressed as such. In terms of wanderers, there may be an opportunity for a response from the judicatory that holds that person accountable, but also can provide a mechanism of rehabilitation and work with them if they are willing to recognize that they are responsible for this harm and take responsibility and be willing to go through a process by which they examine carefully and change their behavior and the way they relate to others. The issue here in the middle of the continuum that we want to highlight at this point is the folks who think that the rules don't apply to them. This is in some ways a new category. It's emerged as we have had this conversation over the years that there is a problem, there are now policies and procedures and so forth and so on, and there's more education about healthy boundaries and the violation of boundaries. There's a category of clergy who basically their response to all this is to say, well, that's fine, but these rules don't apply to me. I'm special, I'm different. And that's a whole nother category in terms of accountability processes for someone who really feels like they are above any kind of limit or expectation that there are particular boundaries in a pastoral relationship. Next slide. In addition, who are the victims? Lots of times people are trying to discern, is there a type of person who ends up being victimized in a pastoral relationship? No, there isn't. What we can say about the persons who are harmed in these situations is it can literally be anyone and anyone who's experiencing vulnerability in their life. And that may be due to a variety of factors, but that vulnerability is what makes them open to exploitation by someone who's willing to take advantage of that. When they cross paths with someone who's a sexual abuser and who has very poor boundaries around sexual interaction, and then you combine that with a context of secrecy, and which is often created and reinforced by an abusive pastor, then you're very likely to get someone who ends up to be a victim. But the point of this is to think about what needs to be moved here to ensure that people are not victimized. So one thing is removing the sexual abuser. So doing everything we can to ensure that our clergy are vetted in terms of their competency and their history. This is why we do background checks on people, removing the context of secrecy so that there's a degree of transparency in the life of the congregation and an expectation of transparency. The reality of vulnerability is something that cannot be removed. It can be modified. It can be assisted. So, for example, with children, we can help their vulnerability by giving them information so that if someone approaches them, they know what to do about that. But in fact, children and youth are by definition vulnerable. People who are in crisis are by definition vulnerable. And they should be safe in their congregation and with their pastor. Next slide, please. So basically what we are dealing with and the dynamic that sets up the potential for exploitation here is an issue of power and vulnerability. For the clergy person, they are in a position of having greater resources and the responsibility for the use of those resources because they have been called into this role of leadership. Persons who experience vulnerability in the context of a congregation simply have fewer resources and therefore have the potential to be violated or exploited. And it is this dynamic of the interaction of power and vulnerability that is absolutely critical for people to understand in understanding how these situations develop and the harm that they cause. Next slide. Briefly, in terms of an ethical understanding of what happens when sexual boundaries are crossed, it's a violation of role and a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And that simply means that as pastors, we have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interests of the congregant. And when we don't do that, we violate our role of pastoral leadership and cause harm. Secondly, it's a misuse of authority and power of the role. And frequently, this is what happens when a pastor uses his or her authority to justify their conduct. This is God's will for us. This is our relationship is blessed by God. There's a whole rationalization that the pastor lays on the congregant to contradict any hesitation that the congregant may have that this doesn't feel right. And that's a misuse of authority and power. And it's certainly taking advantage of the vulnerability of that person. But it's also an absence of meaningful consent. And meaningful consent requires, in a sexual setting, an interaction between peers where both people have the opportunity to say yes or no to that sexual interaction. And this is not such a situation between a pastor and a congregant. Next slide. In terms of the possibility of intervention, and accountability. If there has been a disclosure or a complaint made to the congregation or to the judicatory, there should be in place now a policy that clearly states what behaviors are involved in misconduct and what the position is of the judicatory. And there should be a procedure, which is the mechanism that a complainant can access, whereby the judicatory will respond to that complaint, investigate it, make a determination, and then deal with discipline if that is appropriate and necessary. And that process, I think, can be key to helping a congregation move through this, because it's one step removed from the congregation, but it needs to be done in conjunction with the leadership of a congregation. And again, as I said in the very beginning, that information and the outcome of that process needs to be carefully shared with the members of the congregation. Next slide. Always go to, again, our faith tradition for resources for responding to the misconduct. Use theological and ethical teaching to help people get a handle on this. Use sacred texts. Use the doctrines of your faith tradition that help people reframe the experience and address the situation where someone has betrayed their trust. And the values that the congregation is built on. The values, the importance of the safety and health and well-being of congregants, the responsibility of clergy to engage in integrity in pastoral relationships. Next slide. And finally, in terms of an understanding, a context for what makes for healing, we strongly recommend looking at this as a situation of justice making, and that justice making is what brings forth the possibility of healing for individuals and for a congregation. And the things that we've found over the years in working with individuals and congregations is these are the dynamics that people have expressed have been important for them in their healing process. The first is the opportunity to tell the truth about what has happened to them. So whether that's in an official judicatory process or informally in a congregation, but people to tell their story and what happened to them. And that somehow the faith community, the judicatory, then engages in a process of acknowledging that story and naming the violation so that people feel like they've been heard. And that the response to them is a response of compassion, a willingness to suffer with them as they disclose these traumatic experiences. A commitment on the part of the congregation and judicatory to protecting others who may be vulnerable to the individual who's caused harm. And certainly an accountability process for that individual pastor, so that, again, through the judicatory or through the congregation's leadership, there is a means to hold that person accountable. And finally, restitution is the opportunity to offer the individuals who have been harmed material support for what it has literally cost them, either in terms of their seeking therapy or having medical issues or loss of wages in terms of their job if they've not been able to work, whatever it may be. That restitution is an important act of justice in response to the individual who's been harmed and to assist them with their healing. And finally, all of this results in the possibility of vindication. So the possibility of vindication means not vengeance, but in fact to be set free, so that all of these elements of justice making have the potential to help the individuals who've been harmed and the congregation be set free from that experience and then be able to move on in their life together. Next slide. Don't be afraid to preach on these issues. I think for those of you in interim leadership, the pulpit is one of your most valuable resources. And again, there are a number of ways to do that. Addressing the story of David and Bathsheba is a story of abuse of power by, in this case, King David, who takes advantage of Bathsheba and goes to great lengths to hide his violation, and finally is confronted in what he has done by Nathan. And the passage in Ezekiel 34, which describes the false shepherds and the ways in which false shepherds have violated their role as leaders and protectors of their sheep. And then in Christian scripture, the passage from Luke 17 is the passage about the betrayal of trust of the little ones, that it would be better for those who caused harm to have a millstone hung around their neck and be cast into the sea than that one of these little ones is harmed. And then it goes on to talk about forgiveness in that passage, and that's a way that you can use the passage to help people in their struggle with their sense of the importance of forgiveness, the place of forgiveness. But the passage makes clear that forgiveness is dependent on repentance on the part of the one who's caused harm. Next slide. So in conclusion, in terms of your self-care as an interim pastor, I would just commend to you this passage from Exodus, which is spoken by Moses' father-in-law. And he confronts Moses as Moses is trying to lead the people and says, "What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." And that's the reminder to all of us that we have to call on others to be resources in these situations. We cannot be the only person who's providing the kind of pastoral care and support that people need. And finally, from the book of Hebrews, because I'm sure those of you who've been through this experience in your interim work have experienced the exhaustion that comes with trying to respond to the needs of a congregation that's been traumatized. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. And that is the challenge and the opportunity that we bring in leadership in these situations, that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. And that is the possibility. I've seen congregations come through this with the help of a skilled interim and come out on the other side stronger and with their faith deepened by the experience. But it does take time, and it does take leadership, both by the pastor and the laity. So finally, we have resources for you, and as Sarah said, you'll be getting these slides in email, so you'll have this list of references for resources available to you later on this week. But I want to stop and see just if there are any questions or concerns that you'd like to bring before we close.
So Marie, we actually have several questions. One is, as a congregant, what can you do to assist an interim, especially if there have been accusations or proof of abuse, so that you can assist them in helping the congregation heal?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm sure any interim pastor would be delighted to know that there's a lay leader who's willing and able to help them, to support them in their work. But it highlights the importance of both the interim pastor's leadership, but also the lay leadership in moving through this situation. And I think the main thing is to be clear with the interim that you understand what's happened, you have an awareness of the issues such that you want to support the effort to bring the congregation through this and to be proactive and to help people talk about it in ways that work for them. So that for an interim to know that he or she has lay leadership support makes a huge difference in their ability to carry out their role.
Okay, one other question. How can a pastor go about gaining the trust of a congregation if they're an interim and help deal with people who may be questioning their faith because of the incident?
Again, right on in terms of the issues that you're facing there. I think the short answer to regaining trust is to be trustworthy. And again, that's not to be flip, but to literally be very conscious of, again, healthy boundaries in relation to folks, a consistency of response to people so that they begin to see that, you can be trusted to be consistent, which is part of building trust. But I think ultimately it will take time, and you can do your part, and part of what you need to know is that you will move on, and the next person who does come as a call pastor, it will be their responsibility to pick that up and hopefully continue to rebuild that trust with the congregation. But transparency is a huge part of it, and again, speaking to people where they are and working with them individually and collectively, that they begin to learn that you in fact are a trustworthy resource. But don't expect their trust. They have good reason not to trust you, and that's hard. I think it's hard for a pastor to feel that, but that's where they are, and your job is to be present and be trustworthy in the midst of that. I think for folks who struggle with the challenge to their faith, again, I would just urge the use of scripture and theology and preaching and prayer and kind of all the resources that we have within the faith community to remind us of who we are and of the fundamentals and the foundations of our faith, that God has not abandoned us, even if one of God's servants has. And that's, I think, really so key to the important role that an interim plays, to be able to just continue to bring people back to the fundamentals. And that's why that passage from Jeremiah 17, I think, is a good place to start with that, to remind people that, yes, individual people will betray our trust. That's just the fact of life. But that should not necessarily limit our understanding of who God is in our life and the faithfulness that we experience from a God who loves and stands with us regardless of the circumstance, and even through a trauma like betrayal of trust by one of our leaders.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're actually out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today and thank the In Faith Foundation for sponsoring our webinar. When you close the webinar window in a couple of moments, you'll be prompted to take a short survey, and we'd appreciate it if you would take the time to fill it out and give us your feedback and suggestions. And this is the end of our presentation, so thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks, Marie. Have a good day.